We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Ham and Aleph and Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 75a. The Brisa continues, if a person says to his friend, Halveini kor chitin, v'kotzitz lo damim, he says, lend me a core of wheat, and then they set a price. They essentially evaluate the wheat, evaluate how much is owed back. So then the halach is huzlu, so if the wheat goes down in value, nosin lo chitims, then he can give him wheat. But hukru, but let's say the wheat goes up in value, then you have a problem of potential ribis if he pays back the same amount of wheat because he's paying back more. So in that case, the Brisa says, no sin demeim, in that case, you give the value. But the Gemara asks, v'halo katzatz, but didn't he set a price? Meaning to say, let's say the wheat goes down in value, why is he allowed to pay back in wheat? If he essentially borrowed wheat, and they evaluated what the wheat was worth at that time, and they said that the borrower owes this particular amount of money, then that's the money he owes. If the wheat goes down in value, he shouldn't be able to pay back in wheat. And so the Gemara says, Amar Rav Sheshes says, Hachi Kamer, this is what the Brisa actually means to say. Im lo katzatz, let's say when he borrowed the wheat, they did not evaluate, they didn't set a price. So then it depends, huzlu, if it goes down in value, no tel chitav, so then he can take his wheat, meaning to say, he pays back in wheat, there's no issue of interest because the wheat went down in value. But hukru, but if the wheat went up in value, so then you can't pay back the wheat, there you have an issue of potential interest, so no sin demeim, so then you have to give the value of the wheat, meaning to say the value at the time that the loan was taken. And Rashi explains, v'kotzitz lo damim, you set a certain price, kach v'kach damim kashar shalachshav, you evaluate what is the wheat worth right now, etein lach, that's how much I'm going to give you, v'kamar tanadim huzlu no tel chitin, and then the Brisa says that if the wheat goes down in value, so then he can pay in wheat, he doesn't have to give that money, which is of course problematic, v'hainu deparchinan v'alo katzatz, that's why the Gemara asks, didn't they set a price? V'chi huzlu nami, so even if it went down in value, yitol damim shakatzatz, he should take the amount of money that was set, d'hakamo oz ve'zuzeh, because that would be the same thing. If you're essentially setting a price at the time of the loan, it's basically taking a loan of money, and so that's why Rav Sheshes changed it and said we're talking in the Brisa where they did not set a price. So in that case, again, if the wheat goes down in value, no problem paying back in wheat. But if the wheat goes up in value, then you have an issue of ribis, so you have to pay money. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Lo yomar adam lechavero halveini kor chitin vani etein lach legor. And a person cannot say to his friend, lend me a core of wheat, and then I will give you wheat on the threshing floor, I'll give you the same amount back. Again, that's the same problem. The wheat goes up in value, you then have a problem of ribis. And the Mishnah continues, Aval omer lo, but he could say to him, halveini ad sheyavo b'ni, lend it to me until my son comes, or ad she'emsa mafteach, or until I find the key. And Rashi explains, Aval Omer Halveni at Sheyavo B'ni, Dekevan de Yeshlo, since he has it available to him, Shaper Dami, it's not a problem. Dehasa B'sa D'Rabbanan, because when you lend a saw of wheat for a saw of wheat, that issue is only an issue of Ribis Midrabbanan, the Lav Neshech Doraisa, it's not Ribis on a Doraisa level, V'chiyeshlo Lo Gazer, and so therefore, if he has it available to him, the Rabbanan did not make a Gezerah, that's why you're allowed to do that. However, the Mishnah continues, V'Hillel Oser, Hillel, however, says it's prohibited, V'chein Haya Hillel Omer, and similarly, Hillel said, Lo salvi isha kika lechaverta, a woman should not lend a loaf to her friend ad shetasa damim, until she evaluates. They have to set a price that a specific amount of money is owed. You have the same issue, shema yukru chitin, because maybe wheat will go up in value, v'nimsa bos lidei ribis, and then it will come to a situation of ribis. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna says, Yesh lo saw lava saw sayim lava sayim. If a person has a saw, so then he could borrow a saw. If a person has two saw, then he could borrow two saw. Rabbi Yitzchak says, Afilu yesh lo saw, even if the borrower has one saw, lava ala kamakor, and the fact that he has that available, that's enough to allow him to borrow many core. You don't have to have that same amount, that same exact amount available. You just have to have that product available to you. And the Gemara continues, Tani Rabbi Chia taught l'siyuei Rabbi Yitzchak in order to support what Rabbi Yitzchak said, that even if the borrower has one saw, he can borrow many core. It says, Tipas yayin ein lo, tipas shemen ein lo. It says, if he doesn't have a drop of wine, if he doesn't have a drop of oil, the implication of the Brisa is hayesh lo, but if he did have a drop, lava ola kamatip, and then he could borrow many drops, meaning you don't have to have available the exact same amount that you borrow. And Rashi explains, again, Rabbi Yitzchak said that if you have one saw, you can borrow many core, kama kur and many core, dechol chada v'chada, because every core that you borrow, or every saw that you borrow, amrinon zu teitachta, we say that the one that he has available, that's essentially in its place, sharei eina knuya l'malve uviyado la'ochla, because when you borrow, let's say you borrow wheat, the malve is not the owner of that wheat, the borrower can do whatever he wants, he can eat it, u'lamochra, he can sell it, v'nimtzas osa shalav and his kekas al peiro shabashuk, it comes out that the one he borrowed essentially is relying on the produce in the marketplace, v'zu penuya l'lavos aleh, and this is free, that he can now borrow on it. Ucheshalava kol achas v'achas, when he borrows each one, lava beheter, he's essentially borrowing each one in a permissible fashion. Ta'ilu lava sa achas, because Rashi says, let's say, for example, a person borrowed just one sa, v'yachlan, let's say he consumed the sa that he borrowed, v'yachal gam harishon, and let's say he also consumed the sa that he had at the time of the borrowing, which made it permitted for him to borrow in the first place. Essentially, he consumed everything. There's still no problem. Hoel kishalava beheter lava, since at the time he borrowed, he did it beheter, yishalem chitin, he's allowed to pay back in wheat. That's the halacha. The halacha simply is, at the time of the borrowing, the person has to have the product available. As long as it's available, that is sufficient. And so over here, it's fine. Hachanami here also, kishalava beheter lava kol sa v'sa, when he borrowed, each sa'ah that he's borrowing, he does have a sa'ah readily available. Sharezu amedis, this is readily available, and so therefore you can correspond the sa'ah that he has to each sa'ah that he's borrowing. That's why Rabbi Yitzchak says he can borrow this larger amount. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Hillel Oser, Hillel is strict when it comes to the case of lend me until my son comes or until I find the key. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. Rav Nachman says that Shmuel says, Halacha kedivrei Hillel. The halacha is like Hillel, v'les hilchos hakavasei. But the Gemara says the halacha is not like that. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, V'chein hoya Hillel omer lo salve isha v'chulu. Hillel also said that a woman should not lend a loaf to her friend unless they set up a specific amount, a specific value that is owed. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, Zu divrei Hillel. This is the opinion of Hillel. Aval chachamim omer, but the chachamim say, Lovim stam uporim stam. You can just borrow stam. You don't make any specific set condition in terms of value, etc., and you pay back stam. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel says, B'nei chabura hamakpidin zeh al zeh. Let's say you have people in a group, and they're strict with one another, meaning to say when they eat together, they measure exactly what each person took, and they pay each other back. So in that case, if they're eating with one another on Shabbos, over misham midah, umisham mishkol, umisham minyan, they transgress in terms of measuring or weighing or counting on Shabbos, umisham lavin, uporin, b'yontiv, also in terms of borrowing and paying back on yontiv, uchedivrei Hillel, and according to Hillel, af misham ribis, there's even a violation of ribis in this situation. Again, that's talking about a situation where the prices, the values might fluctuate. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, and Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, Talmidei chachamim mutarim l'lavos zemi zeh b'ribis. Talmidei chachamim, it's mutter for them to borrow from one another, even with interest. The Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Meidai yadi d'ribis asur. Talmidei chachamim know that ribis is asur. Umatanahu d'yahavu hadadi. They're just giving a gift to one another. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Shmuel li'avua bar'i. Shmuel said to Avua bar'i, Halveini meya pilpulin, lend me 100 peppers. B'meya v'asrin pilpulin, I'll pay you back 120 peppers, v'yarech, and everything will be good with that. The reason why that's good is because I'm just giving you a gift. It's not intended as ribis. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, Mutter lo la'adam lahalvos bano v'vnei beiso b'ribis. A person is allowed to lend his sons and the people of his household with interest, kedei lahatimon tam ribis, in order to give them a taste of what ribis is like. But the Gemara says, V'lav milsi, that's not really true, mishum dasi l'misrach, because what's going to happen is that's going to cause them to sin. And Rashi explains, lahatimon, to give them a taste of interest, sheyedu kama mitzdaru meitzer hanosno, v'yavinu kama onsho gadol, they understand how much pain interest causes, and they'll understand that it's a great punishment. But then the Gemara said you shouldn't do that because l'misrach lahargil sheyachmod livam haskar. On the contrary, they might desire the profit, and therefore it's not a good idea to do this. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Omer adam l'chaveiro, a person can say to his friend, nachesh imi, weed with me in my field, v'anachesh imcha, and then at a later date I'll do it with you. Ador imi, till with me in my field, v'ador imcha, and again at a later date I'll do that with you. However, v'lo yomar lo, he shouldn't say to him, nachesh imi v'ador imcha, he shouldn't say weed with me and then I'll till with you, or ador imi v'anachesh imcha, till with me and then I'll weed with you. And Rashi explains, Avalo yomer lo nachesh imi hayom v'ador imcha lizman ploni, pa'amim shazu kasha mizu, because maybe one work is harder than the other. V'yesh kan agar natole b'schar shemamtin lo aschar pulaso, and so you really have a case of interest over here because he's delaying and paying him back, and then he's doing a harder labor for him. At osozmanu makavel olav malacha shikasha mizu, at this later date he's doing a more difficult malacha, more difficult work, and that is going to be problematic. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Hey Amid Beis.